Well, welcome to you all. This is the first session in season 2 of Black History Lunchtime Conversations. So we've got a group of folks here today, and we're delighted that Dr. Richard Anderson is going to speak about his subject, which is slavery, the university and the country house in northeast Scotland. So I think if I can just add in that the university I think that you'll be talking about will be the University of Aberdeen. And I did a little bit of research to find out why the University of Aberdeen was kind of probably of interest in this context. And it really is some fascinating stuff to find out there. So without more ado, welcome to you all. Happy New Year. Just cope wherever you are with whatever circumstances you're coping with. But on Friday lunchtimes or whatever time of day it is for you, then we're just taking a little break and also recording this so that people who want to hear the presentations and some of the discussion will also have an opportunity. And we put that on the website, which is www.spanglefish.com/Black History, and I've been doing some work updating that. So with no more ado, Simon, that's if you can, you've done the screen share or whatever you're doing. So over to you, Richard.
All right, I'm going to share my screen, and as we get that set up, I'd like to take the opportunity to say Happy New Year, and thanks to Liz and Simon for the invitation to share some of the work that I've been undertaking since joining the University of Aberdeen in September of 2020, looking at particularly on the history of slavery and the slave trade in relation to the university and the northeast of Scotland. Scholarship on Scotland's involvement in empire and transatlantic slavery has proliferated over the past 2 decades. And historians, including Ian White, Stephen Mullen, Diana Patton, and Douglas Hamilton, have shown that the British Empire was truly a British enterprise by documenting the relative overrepresentation of Scots as enslavers and colonial administrators within the empire. So this research has done much to overcome the historical erasure of complicity in slavery and the slave trade and the denial of colonial legacies relating to Scotland. And of course, the research and advocacy of Sir Geoff Palmer, who joined some of our discussions before Christmas, has extended this discussion and debate beyond the academy and into public spotlight. Much of this research and national attention has focused on Glasgow as a city of empire, while other studies have emphasized the place of Edinburgh as an important educational hub, particularly in the fields of medicine in relation to the British Empire. And a major exception to this focus, particularly on Glasgow, is of course David Alston's 2 decades of research as presented on his website Slaves and Highlanders, which has drawn attention to the involvement of Northern Scotland in transatlantic slavery. And most recently, Ian McKinnon and Andrew McKillop of Coventry and Glasgow universities have released a research paper documenting how more than 100 million of wealth forged through slavery in the Caribbean and North America was used to buy up estates in the West Highlands and Islands, resulting in a new slavery elite. In light of this growing body of research, the National Trust of Scotland is undertaking a new project, Facing Our Past, to examine the historical connections between slavery and their properties. And of course, public attention for this often uncomfortable history has been seen in several recent television programs, from BBC's 2018 Slavery, Scotland's Hidden Shame, to the broadcast in 2020 of Scotland, Slavery and Statues, which featured Sir Geoff Palmer, and BBC Alba's episode of Europa on slavery and the Highlands, which featured David Alston, and which I should mention is being reshown tonight if you have access to BBC Alba or iPlayer. So we now have a more complete picture of Scotland's involvement in Atlantic slavery that extends beyond the Clyde to the north of Scotland. And in northeastern Scotland, the connections between Caribbean slavery are perhaps not as immediately obvious as in Glasgow, where street names of the merchant city bear the names of Virginia Street, Jamaica Street, and St. Vincent Street, or the names of the so-called tobacco lords. Well, we can see these connections in a number of ways between the Northeast and the Caribbean. That includes tracing the number of Northeasterners who went to the Caribbean during the age of Atlantic slavery as doctors, naval officers, plantation owners as overseers. We can see this in the naming of plantations, of Aberdeen and Montrose, of settlements with these names, and the enslaved themselves who were given names such as Aberdeen across the Caribbean. And we can see a tangible link between the University of Aberdeen and chattel slavery at the very heart of the Aberdeen campus. Pictured here is the Powis Gate or Powis Gateway, which is located on college bounds at the center of the university's campus. The gates once served as the entrance to Powis House, a 19th century mansion in North Aberdeen, which has been a community center since 1941. So this is an entrance to what was once the Leslie family estate and was paid for in part by money received by the family as compensation for the loss of their formerly enslaved at Castile Fort Penn plantation in Jamaica. So at the time of emancipation in the West Indies, the British government compensated the Leslie family some £6,000, more than £600,000 today, for the loss of their enslaved property, while the formerly enslaved received no reparations for their years of unpaid labor and suffering. And so although its links to slavery have been given more publicity lately, it's likely that not all students and staff who walk past the Powis Gateway know about its provenance. And as such, the university is currently in discussions with the community, including the Old Aberdeen Heritage Society, the Old Aberdeen Community Council, Grampian Regional Equality Council, and the Powis Community Center to explore how best to contextualize the history of Powis Gateway and properly memorialize those who paid for its construction with their unpaid labor in Jamaica. So Powis Gateway is a physical reminder of the historical connections with slavery and the University of Aberdeen as a 525-year-old institution. And the university is currently undertaking a 2-year research project, which I'm heading, to examine the legacy of historic slavery to the University of Aberdeen within the context of the broader region, including the city of Aberdeen and the northeast of Scotland. So part of this study will be to explore and contextualize the financial legacy of slavery to the university and produce a financial report on endowments which the university has received that can be traced to wealth resulting from historic slavery. So in the talk today, I would briefly like to discuss the work that has been done and some of the goals for this project over the next 2 years. The university's carried out a small-scale study to identify which of the live financial endowments derived from historic slavery, that is, cash value of remaining endowments circa 2019, when the study was undertaken. The study, which was restricted to endowments made before 1900, suggested that the university retains live endowments worth about £305,000 that are known or suspected to be linked to the historic slave trading or plantations in the West Indies. And this was a limited study, and work is now being done to consider both the original value of endowments, much of which has been spent, and the value of those endowments in the present day, accounting for inflation. And as a small scale study, it selected only the current high value endowments for investigation, so it was not able to identify all the endowments that had historic links to slavery. And so research over the next 2 years will substantially expand upon this preliminary study in order to see how Aberdeen has benefited from historical slavery. So a few individuals and individual examples illustrate some of these connections between slavery, alumni, and gifts and bursaries over the university's 5 centuries of existence. For example, John Henderson left some £500 to his alma mater, Marshall College. So the present day University of Aberdeen, although we say it was founded in 1495, was until 1860, 2 separate institutions within the city. King's College founded in 1495 and Marshall College founded a century later. So John Anderson left his alma mater, Marshall College, £500 to provide for bursaries, while also leaving an annuity of £50 to serve to Thomas, who he called his black servant. Some of this wealth was derived from the fact that his wife inherited, along with 3 sisters, a share of the Friendship estate in Jamaica from her uncle, Dr. Charles Irvine of Aberdeen. Perhaps the most well-known individual related to this history is Gilbert Ramsay, who was an Episcopalian minister from the parish of Birse in Aberdeenshire, born around 1658. According to our graduation rolls, he graduated Marshall College in 1674. He became an ordained minister, and in 1689, he was minister of St. Paul's Parish on the Caribbean island of Antigua. So he was there from 1686 to 89, at which time he moved to Barbados and lived there for almost 4 decades as a rector of Christ Church. In Barbados, Gilbert was well connected. He married twice, in both instances, to women of prominent planter families. And after his second wife's death, he returned to England and died soon after in Bath in 1728. So during his 4 decades in Jamaica, Ramsay grew wealthy enough to leave behind substantial bequests to his alma mater and the place where he grew up. In his will, he left some £5,500 to charitable causes. His home parish of Birse received £1,000 for a school and poor fund, and records in our special collection show that he bequeathed £3,800, a substantial amount at the time. So Ramsay paid for his benefaction partly through the sale of an unknown number of enslaved people. In his will, he specified, and apologies for the insensitive language, which I'll only use when quoting from period sources. He said that all my slaves, excepting my Negro man Robert here, now attending me, be immediately sold after my decease, and appoint that all the money arising by such sale of my Negro shall be applied with the rest of my estate towards the payment of my legacies. So the Robert that was mentioned here was Ramsay's man or personal servant who was with him in Bath when he died in 1728. And among those enslaved by Ramsay, Robert was the only person not sold upon the death of their enslaver. Ramsay's will declared that to my said Negro Robert, I give his freedom from the day of my decease, and I will that he shall be taken care of and sent to Barbados at my charge as soon as may be after my decease, and that the executors of this will do pay him £5 of that country money at his arrival at Barbados. But at present, little is known of Robert after this will, and indeed, much of what we know of Gilbert comes from the will itself. So a final example of some of these connections between university, the region, and historical benefaction tied to slavery is an example that David Alston brought to my attention. This is someone who's not an alumnus nor benefactor of the university, but his case illustrates some of the complexities in discussing an institution and the financial legacies of slavery. James Dick was born in Morayshire in 1743 and left at the age of 19 for the West Indies and settled in Kingston, Jamaica. He became a clerk in a merchant house and a partner of Robert Milligan, and the firm of Dick and Milligan imported colonial produce into London, but their business also involved slave factorage, that is the buying of enslaved people in bulk from slave ships for sale to clients across Jamaica. So after 20 years, James Dick transferred his business to his brother, returned to London, a very wealthy man. At the time of his death, James Dick had a fortune estimated at £200,000. And following his death, he bequeathed more than £100,000 to encourage learning and efficient teaching among the parish schoolmasters of Elgin, Banff, and Aberdeen. The charity known as the Dick Bequest Trust continues to make awards to school boards in the region. And the governing body consists of 10 elected governors, 2 of whom are elected by the University of Aberdeen Senate. So while James Dick was not a benefactor of the University of Aberdeen, the University Senate play a role in the distributions of funds derived from West Indian enslavement. So through these individuals, we can see the financial legacy of unremunerated labor in the Caribbean within Northeast Scotland. The wealth that flowed from this region to this region from the West Indies also funded the building, renovation, or expansion of a number of estates and country houses in Aberdeenshire and across Northeast Scotland. As William Watt wrote in his 1900 A History of Aberdeen and Banff, it is surprising how many landed estates in Aberdeenshire and the adjacent counties were purchased by means of fortunes acquired in the trade of the West Indies. So on the right is only a partial list of some of these properties within the region, and a full list would be extensively longer. Longer still is the list of Caribbean plantations owned by Northeast Scots. Again, a complete list would be very lengthy, and the following includes some of the better known estates. And of course, these New World plantations are linked and were often responsible for the construction or aggrandizement of Northeastern properties. And I want to highlight one particular plantation here, the Georgia estate of Trelawney on Jamaica's north coast, which Charles Gordon of the Gordons of Buthlow and Cairness purchased in about 1778. So I'm highlighting this particular estate, Cairness House, and its absentee owner, Charles Gordon, for two reasons. First, income from Georgia estate allowed Charles Gordon in the 1790s to build one of the finest new homes in northeast of Scotland, that is Cairness near Long May. The second reason is that the papers of the Gordon family and correspondence on the management of the Georgia estate are found within the University of Aberdeen's special collections, including the two images here. The image on the left is of the Georgia estate in Jamaica in 1860, and the image on the right is a rendition of Cairness House. So the University of Aberdeen's collections, special collections, are a rich source for documentary evidence relating to the transatlantic slave trade and plantation slavery, as well as the abolitionist movement. As an institution founded in 1495, the 5 centuries of the university's existence are reflected in the archives as the main repository for archival collections for the northern half of Scotland. So we have a geographical range of holdings from British colonies in Jamaica, Tobago, St. Kitts, St. Vincent, and Dominica, as well as North America from the 1700s into the post-abolition era. And so alongside the Gordons of Buthlow and Cairness, there are other prominent families who benefited from slavery and whose papers are held at the university, including the Earls of Fife, the Grants of Moneymusk, the Leslies of Wart Hill, and the Shand family of the Burn. So all profited from the trade, and many publicly demonstrated the wealth they had amassed through grand architectural statements, and none more so than in the case of Cairness, where the house interior and gardens were lavishly redesigned in the 1790s. So Charles Gordon, who owned both Georgia Estate and Cairness House, was, like many, an absentee proprietor who only visited Jamaica on occasion, once establishing their trading interests before repairing to Scotland. They were therefore reliant on a cast of professionals, doctors, attorneys, managers, and agents to ensure that the profit they enjoyed continued to flow back to Scotland. And so in the case of the Georgia estate, it was another Northeast Scot, Francis Grant, of the Grants of Castle Grant, who managed the estate, and much of the documentation we have within the archive is Grant's correspondence from Jamaica to Scotland. So one example here from the university's special collections is the 1789 letter, where Grant informed Gordon that, agreeably to your permission signified in a late letter, I have put a few new Negroes upon Georgia out of an Ebo cargo I lately sold myself. They consist of 4 women, which he purchased for a price of £63 each, someone he refers to as a woman girl at £61, and 4 little girls at £59 each. Recorded coolly as a simple transaction, this brief update reveals certain dynamics about the slave trade to Jamaica and the Caribbean in general. We can see here how age and gender were valued. All of these individuals who were purchased were at a lower price than what Grant paid soon after for an enslaved male at 80 pounds. There's also a question of terminology of woman girl and little girl in relation to plantation labor. And you'll also see here a reference to what Grant refers to as an Igbo cargo. And this suggests that the enslaved Africans arrived from present-day southeastern Nigeria. And we're considering particularly some of this in connection with the history of Nigeria in our discussions. This is likely a reference to the Igbo people of southwestern Nigeria. And during the last quarter of the 18th century, an estimated 113,000 enslaved Africans reached Jamaica from this region, which Europeans at the time referred to as the Bight of Biafra, more than any other African coastline. So when we're looking at the history of this particular plantation and of plantations in Jamaica at this period, there's a strong connection with what in a later century becomes the southwestern region of Nigeria. So the 9 women that Grant purchased in 1789 joined an enslaved population on Georgia estate, which numbered nearly 200 in the 1780s. So this next document, which is also in our special collections, is a list of the enslaved population of the Georgia estate in 1781, in which 107 enslaved men and 83 enslaved women are enumerated alongside a list of stock and property, that is livestock and furniture. And lists such as this grow in number in our collections in the 19th century. As the prospect of emancipation became increasingly certain, enslavers took greater interest in monitoring the birth and deaths of the enslaved, particularly after Britain's Act for the Abolition of the Slave Trade in 1807. So the document you see here records a decrease in the enslaved population on Georgia estate from 252 to 245 in the year 1822. That is some 15 years after the abolition of the slave trade to the island. So in the decades before emancipation within the empire, the British government also took a number of slave censuses of their West Indian colonies in order to know more about the enslaved population of British territories. And even as planters monitored their own enslaved populations through documents such as this, planters were hostile to the idea of government interference through what became known as slave registration. The British government nevertheless undertook slave censuses in the 1810s and 1820s, and they provide another indication of the extent of Northeast Scottish participation in transatlantic slavery and plantations in the West Indies. So for example, if we look at the 1817 government slave census, we see that it records almost 300 enslaved people who were named Aberdeen throughout the British West Indies. And if we look too at colonial newspapers, we can see in the example on the left, an enslaved man named Aberdeen who was bought and sold in the Jamaica's Royal Gazette, announcing the sale of a man named Aberdeen at Kingston City Tavern. But the Aberdeens of the West Indies resisted their enslavement, and I'd like to focus particularly on resistance in the remainder of my talk. In this 1828 advertisement from the Antigua Register, a man named Aberdeen absconded from the Monteros plantation, and the advertisement cautioned ship owners against hiring or harboring him. The advertisement appeared twice more in subsequent weeks, but beyond that, we cannot know what happened to this particular man who was given the name of Aberdeen. So freedom-seeking slaves also reached Aberdeen and beyond in their flight to refuge. This is a particularly interesting example in 1829 of an enslaved man from Jamaica named W.M. Lansdowne, who made his way to Aberdeen and briefly lived here before making his way to Orkney and making an appeal to the justices of the peace on the island, who found that this man was entitled to the freedom he claimed and could not be compelled against his will to leave the island and returned to the West Indies. So this is an interesting case that took place some 22 years after abolition of the British slave trade. and more than a half century after the famous case of Joseph Knight, in which the Court of Session in Edinburgh ruled that Scots law could not support the status of slavery. So we can see that resistance was ever present, particularly on Jamaica and throughout the British Caribbean. In another letter from Grant to Charles Gordon, he complains that there are 3 Africans on his estate who are irreclaimable runaways. So far from being of any use to you, they are rather attacks by the loss of labor occasioned in looking for them, as well as frequent payment of jail fees. And the specter of resistance, and particularly violent resistance, became more acute 7 years later with the outbreak of the Haitian Revolution on the neighboring French colony of Saint-Domingue. This is a document that I'd found in our special collections, and it's one that I'm particularly fascinated to teach with. It really lays bare the growing sense of planter disquiet over the specter of the Haitian Revolution being a model that spreads throughout the Caribbean. So in this letter from Kingston in 1791, it says that we are at present very much alarmed at accounts of recently received from our neighboring island of Hispaniola, where a most dreadful rebellion has broken out among the slaves, who have burnt and laid waste a very extensive and fertile part of the island, and massacred all the white people of every age and sex who had the misfortune to fall into their power. And it says at the end, it is totally impractical to keep the knowledge of the rebellion in Hispaniola from our slaves in Jamaica, who in all probability will determine their conduct by the ultimate fate of their brethren in the former island. Another letter from Jamaica soon after requested that Britain send, quote, send us at least another regiment and 2 or 3 magistrates without delay, so that they may be here by Christmas, which is the most dangerous time. The mischief is so near us that we cannot well escape it. So the Haitian Revolution did not ultimately inspire Georgia's enslaved population to revolt, but the letter writers were found very well founded in their fears. This is down to identifying Christmas as what they called our most dangerous time. Oops, sorry. And we can see this if we move forward several decades to Christmas Day 1831, when the enslaved population of Jamaica's western parishes instigated the most massive and destructive slave revolt in the history of British slavery. What became known as the Baptist War, also known as the Sam Sharp Rebellion, the Christmas Rebellion, or Christmas Uprising, drew in an estimated 60,000 enslaved people on the island. And again, this is a final document from the university's special collections, which show that 5 enslaved men on the Georgia estate, Edward Grant, John Bailey, John Kelly, Robert Lamont, and Thomas Reed, joined the freedom fight. The rebellion was violently repressed by the military and local militia. At least 300 enslaved participants were executed following hasty trials, though the 5 from Georgia estate were instead tried by court-martial and given life sentences in workhouses. And many historians attribute the Baptist War as being a contributing factor in hastening the passage of emancipation through British Parliament 2 years later in 1833. But of course, emancipation came at the massive price in the form of compensation to slave owners, estimated in today's terms as at least being of 17 billion pounds, which paid for estates in Northeast Scotland and Powis Gate on the university's campus. So within the university, with our campus, our built environment, and within the university's archives, we see copious documentation of both the complicity of Northeast Scots in plantation slavery, but also enslaved people who constantly resisted their enslavement. And so I'll finish by saying that what I've presented today is very much the preliminary stages of a 2-year project examining this legacy of historic slavery to the university and within the region. The research also coincides with the 525th anniversary of the University of Aberdeen, and particularly in light of Black Lives Matter, how the university handles the complex history, including alumni and benefactors such as Gilbert Ramsey. So I hope that over the next 2 years, as this research develops, I will be able to share more with you. And as a concluding remark, I'd just like to offer 2 particular thank yous. First is to David Alston, who has shared with me a wealth of material, more than I could present here today. So this is very much the beginning of a discussion. And secondly, to the University of Aberdeen's archivists. The material I've shared is what I've been able to look at under very difficult circumstances over the past 3 months. And what I've shared today would have been impossible without them.
Wow, fantastic. David, I'm going to pass over to you first of all, because clearly what Richard was just saying is that a lot of your research over the last 20 years is very much benefiting what Richard's able to do, and also what Richard is able to do now with this 2-year project will very much benefit more people knowing about your work. So am I okay just passing on to you, David, for a moment?
Yes, thanks very much, and it is very exciting for me to see what Richard taking this forward. I wondered if it would be possible. I know Richard had to skip over a number of the slides, and I wonder if it would be possible to share Richard's presentation with the group so that we can look at some of the detail he wasn't able to cover. Really, just a couple of comments and questions. I mean, one of my experiences of working in archives is that there's a history of the way in which archives are catalogued. And very often there can be archives that have a huge amount about the history of involvement with slavery and slave plantations and the slave trade, but the word slave and slavery just doesn't appear in the catalogues. So often I think there are, it seems to me that there are archives where people sometimes think there's not very much here that's relevant, and yet when people start looking, there is this enormous amount of material. I know this happened with the Highland Archives in Inverness, who've got an extraordinarily rich collection, but didn't know that they had it because of the way in which it had been catalogued. So the first question, I wondered if that was Richard's experience as well. The second question is, I think it's a sort of ethical question. The material here is there is a wealth of information on on Africans and their descendants, and that information is here in British archives. So there is something about a kind of, I don't know if reparation is the right word, but it's about making this history available to the people whose history it is. And that can only be done by digitizing, by making it freely available. I'm very impressed by some of the work that the Netherlands National Archives have done. And I wonder if, and I think we need to push our institutions to do something similar. So Richard talked about the government slave registers. There's quite a number of these have been digitized, but they were digitized by Ancestry.co, and then there was, I think, legitimate protest at the fact that people whose ancestors had been slaves were having to pay to access the records. Now, Ancestry have now made what they digitized available, but I think the result of that is that the process of digitization has stopped. So that, for example, the Demerara registers, which at the end of slavery was one of the major British colonies, that hasn't been digitized. So really the two questions were: has this been your experience of archives, and do you think there is any chance through your work of addressing that question of how we make this material available to the people whose history it is?
Yeah, no, thank you for both questions. I'm really quite both of some urgency. I think, a lot of this work was looking at curriculum development and teaching, and particularly teaching with special collections. And really was not anticipating first the scale of collections that we have, really drawing upon all of Northern Scotland. And also the level to which it's cataloged. As guides, we have specific guides for documentation related to the history of the Americas, particularly the history of slavery and the slave trade. Some of these can be updated, but a lot of work was done going back to the bicentenary in 2007. I will be happy to share the PowerPoint simply because at the end that has some of the links to some of the work that was done prior to my arrival, which was quite substantial. Oftentimes you have it where you have family papers, so their connection with this history is known. Within that, there's various levels of organization. Some are quite precise down to item level. Some, when you have 1,200 boxes, these are families that, over generations of papers. And we have cases where plantations remain in the family into the 20th century, decades after emancipation. So on the whole, it's incredibly well documented, I think, but it's a struggle everywhere. And obviously before coming here, I worked at the University of Exeter's Cornwall campus, and I did some work with the Cornwall County Archives, Crescent-Curnow. And their experience was that they thought they had very little on Black history, but that was a question of how items were described within the catalog, which relates to their historic acquisition. And you realize that there's actually a tremendous amount because the Southwest is so connected with the Atlantic, particularly through maritime trade. But it involved tagging items in particular ways. It also means things like, well, it's often very anachronistic and at times language that's no longer politically correct, given that sometimes the archival catalog for a particular item was written at the moment of its acquisition. But then that's always a question of resources, especially for regional archives, especially at this particular moment where they don't know if they're going to be allowed into their workplace. So I worked over the summer in Cornwall where they wanted to undertake a lot of this work, but in that moment of Black Lives Matter, of course, that was a moment when archives, as with any other place of work, was entirely shut down. The question of sort of dissemination is important, and I think there's a lot more to do in terms of digitizing and presenting this history and having this sort of material, particularly in some form of open access to really share this. My own experience comes from working on projects in Sierra Leone Public Archives. The British Library has an endangered archives project that works in West Africa, the Caribbean, and beyond, really looking at digitizing and preserving. But I think from that experience, I also saw that a lot of caution has to be taken because a lot of emphasis is put on the digitization, less so on the preservation and the dissemination. So what are you giving back, especially for archives in places like Sierra Leone, Guyana, that allows that material to be preserved? And how do you make it so that it's not an extractive exercise? How do you actually make it so that people can access this material? And that's something that I think about a lot. Obviously, as academics, we publish in traditional formats of monographs and articles. I've been involved in database projects insofar as they have the possibility to break that down. So I think as this work progresses, thinking about, well, what is the appropriate model? In your own work, where there's just a fantastic amount of documentation there that's so much more useful for academics, but also for the general public. And in the PowerPoint, I have a link for an online resource that the university produced in 2007 called the Northeast Story that has some of this documentation, but I think it's really something that's in need of an update and an expansion rather than placing this work into a sort of traditional academic article.
Fantastic. That's really, really helpful. And I certainly know I've got a couple of follow-up things, but over to other people who might like to ask or comment. Any other ones at the moment? Right, well, I'll go on with mine then. I'm really interested because I had no idea that the University of Aberdeen would be would have a link with the slave trade for starters, but that you'd got such an archive of materials. Now, Caroline Sansom and I and others in North Wales are very much focused on the story of Penrhyn Castle and the Pennant family, which is what I said I'd mention perhaps a little later on, but it comes into this context because Bangor University managed to acquire the records of the correspondence of the Pennant family as they managed their plantations into the 20th century. And there's something that I want to follow up and ask for some advice and help about that. But anyway, stick a pin in that. But what I'm interested in is that there was somebody who catalogued all this paperwork who was employed at the university, and I thought, oh, wonderful! It'll be possible to link with the reparation unit at the University of the West Indies, and they'll be able to access the materials. But it's only a catalogue of the headings, so you can't actually see the thing. I was so disappointed. 2 years and we've only got, but shows how much stuff there is. So I don't know. Do you have any links with the University of Bangor?
No, I don't. No,
Well, there's a lot of parallels going on.
yeah. And I think,
except that the University of Bangor is not acknowledging at present, to my knowledge. I mean, bear in mind, I'm in Australia. But I don't think, they certainly weren't when I was last in Wales, they didn't seem to be doing anything about recognising the benefits that might have been direct benefits. And yet, for example, the city of Bangor has a hall called Penrhyn Hall, like the main town hall. And that was money from the Penrhyn family enabled that to happen, and I'm sure there are other things. So it'll be quite interesting maybe to see if we could link. And I think your point as well, or the point that was made about materials being made available for the descendants of enslaved people, I think that's so important. So my other bit of the question is, have you got any links with the reparation unit at the University of the West Indies?
No, and also sort of looking at maybe I'll perhaps look at these in sort of reverse order, where I've, some connections, particularly with their Mona campus, which is outside of Kingston and on 2 or 3 former plantations. These are linkages that we are building up. And I think, we have a model that of course comes from the University of Glasgow, who undertook really a pioneering report that was published in 2018, looking at historical connections and the legacy of slavery. And from that report, building a relationship with the University of the West Indies. So in a sense, that comes out of the report and looking at where these connections are and the possibilities for doing something along those lines. Particularly looking at, well, how can we look at perhaps the history of particular properties with their counterparts in Jamaica today, some of which still operate and produce rum, for example. Some are nature reserves. So looking at the subsequent histories as much as possible and what can be built from there. That really comes out about really, I think, looking at these connections. A lot of the examples I had today were from Jamaica. When we looked at David's presentation, a lot of the strongest connections were with Guyana, for example. So if that were to emerge, we've mooted the idea of potentially looking with the University of Guyana, which is not a part of the University of the West Indies, but really it comes from teasing out, where are these connections? There's particular connections with Grenada, for example, which is a small enough island where it's possible to undertake, for example, oral history work, and there's a strong sort of transfer of knowledge and history for over 2 centuries. So this is very much sort of the preliminary work to tease out some of those connections. And I think if we're comparing it to Bangor or other universities, this is something that universities are looking at in the UK, in the United States as well. To a lesser extent, perhaps, in say Australia or Canada, where I'm from, and this relates to some degree to particular institutional histories, particularly to when they're founded. So there are a number of universities in the United States looking at this history, places like the College of William and Mary, Georgetown. These tend to be universities founded before the American Civil War. In many cases, such as Princeton, these are the colonial colleges founded before the American Revolution. In the case of Aberdeen, we're the 5th oldest English-speaking university in the world. So its history dating back to 1495, quite different from, say, institutions founded in the 19th and 20th century, as the majority of universities in England, Scotland, and Wales are. It's the case in Scotland that we have a number of so-called ancient universities. And I think in part that relates to the fact that in some ways the amount of work that's been done is more substantial here. But I think there is that question, and I came from a university campus that was founded in 2005 in Cornwall. So we're teasing out these connections, but it's quite different depending on particular institutional histories.
Yes, I think that's interesting because Bangor University certainly isn't an ancient university, and had an interesting origin, but we won't go into that at the moment. So with the University of the West Indies, I've got close contacts there, and Professor Hilary Beckles is the Pro Vice Chancellor, and he's done so much work on this. And they have now a reparation unit, which is led by Professor Vereen Shepherd. And I think she'll come and join one of our sessions one time. She does a really good radio program called Talking History. And she's invited me to go and talk about the Penance Project, another opportunity later this month. So I've got good contacts there. And for those of you, perhaps only Caroline here with Welsh links though, oh no, Helen as well, Mona University site of the University of the West Indies. Mona is a Welsh name. It's a name for the island of Anglesey. But they don't seem to acknowledge that in any way. And I can't work out what the plantation link might be. But I have been to Mona Great House, which was an interesting thing. Okay, so that was oh, it's just so fascinating what you were saying, and I could see so many potential links. So gosh, that's really opened up this whole story. So thanks to David and all the others who've done research in the past, and Professor Sir Jeff Palmer as well, and his activities. I've known Professor Palmer for about, I don't know, maybe about 15, 20 years. And I was always so impressed by how he told the story. But in the beginning, he was having to really challenge historians in Scotland and challenge the National Trust to acknowledge the stories. So it's fascinating for me to hear more about the Scottish stories. So is there anybody else who's got anything that they want to ask Richard? No, Professor Saki.
Okay. Not really a question, but to appreciate the presentation, because from this side of the Atlantic, we normally teach the history of slavery from the point of view that we are victims, Europeans are beneficiaries, and what do we do? Of course, the big question for us here is, should reparations be paid? Yes, but in what way? So unlike some universities as mentioned, or which Liz has mentioned, that have reparations desks, I'm not sure any university in Africa has that desk. Maybe they exist, but I don't know. But it will be quite interesting to share, those kinds of experiences, to know the nature of the reparations, how they are paid, we have been thinking that reparations can go a long way to heal the wounds, and the reparations may not necessarily be financial. but there can be some sort of investments in infrastructure in Africa, improving education, improving health, improving roads, and so on. But how to coordinate this back in Africa is really a big challenge. But I should say thank you to Richard for giving me more knowledge of this. When I opened my books to see whether Scotland is mentioned in relation to slavery, those details are not in books taught here in Africa, in Nigeria, that I have come across. So each time I have a discussion on slavery from your own side, it's a new improvement for me. It is new knowledge for me, and I am grateful.
Thank you very much for that. Helen, would you like to?
Just very briefly, I mean, I was quite shocked, especially since it's my own history, and that to learn the length of time between the act of abolition and the time when slaves were supposedly emancipated, and the fact what was still going on. But like Liz, I'm interested about the North Wales links, and particularly whether there are other estates in North Wales that benefited in any way, whether it's directly or indirectly. I'm researching Bodlewyddan Castle, and I just wonder how much of the fortunes came through that route. But I have well, not a question, but a level of interest in what is happening in relation to the collection of history from places like Nigeria. And I don't know whether the oral histories have ever been kept, and noted, so that we have some information about the people who were left behind. I know that slavery continued in Africa, particularly. My knowledge is a bit more about East Africa with the Arab slavery. But I just wonder how much of the history we actually haven't actually seen, but is actually still there as oral histories and so on. And I wondered if it's something that we could look at a later stage. What information people like Sati may be able to give us.
Yeah, there's a lot of textbook history on the slave trade, but the documents that give us the details are in the archives in London or somewhere, and then those details are not in the archives in Nigeria. The archives in Nigeria, for example, would deal with just the efforts of the colonial administration to end slavery, but it doesn't give us the details of who did what, where the records are, and the archival files, therefore, are stronger on that side than on this side. So we have textbook accounts of the slave trade, but we don't have original writings or documents of the slavers to reconstruct history. So much of what is oral is actually written history that is now oralized. I'm not sure you can find people who experienced slavery or who witnessed slavery. You can't find them now. So we're just recycling from what we read in the books. And so if Richards maybe publishes this and I read it, I recycle it. So we just oralize that. And then the books that have been written are mainly from a general perspective. Of course, some people had gone to the archives in London to look at these things, maybe in the US to look at these things, but the books are more of generalizations. Africans have been enslaved from Angola, from East Africa, from West Africa. The specifics of who was involved, the nationalities, the ethnicities are not very strongly represented, except by construction or interpretation, like Richard did in mentioning Igbo. The spelling of Igbo has now changed. So any person who reads, unless you are very intelligent like Richard, you would know that you are referring to the same Igbo that he is referring to. So you might think that you are referring to a different kind of person. But of course, it means that the English language has changed over time and spellings have also changed. So we are struggling to understand slavery from the archives in the destination, not the receiving countries. The material don't exist at this end, but we have the books that reconstruct.
I think this is just so interesting, and there's those of us who aren't academic researchers, and but for those of you who are in universities, I mean, I can see it being extremely beneficial to have these sorts of
Sure.
links and getting to know
Extremely.
people, you know, and being able to communicate in a friendly and informed way. Richard, I'm so grateful. Your presentation, when you told me the title of it, Slavery, the University and the Country House in North East Scotland, I thought, right, this will be interesting, but what's it going to be about? So I used the term that you were going to explore it and share it with us. So that was really good on the poster. So Richard, I'm aware that sometimes academics don't like to just give away their research and their information. So how do you feel about us with the PowerPoint? Is it okay for us to put that on the website?
Yes, absolutely. And
Oh,
you know,
that would be wonderful.
and if there's any questions that come up from that, I sort of gave the short answer to yourself and to Helen, but I think feel free also to email, and I'm sure we'll follow up on subsequent Fridays as well.
Thank you very much indeed. And at the beginning of your talk, I
Yes.
think you were reading it so you could remember all the people you were thanking. It would be really good to maybe have at least that part of the text to
Okay.
share, because I think it's really so valuable to recognize. And Sati, when you were doing your presentation before Christmas and you were talking about the historians from Africa and telling us the names of, you know, the books they'd written and showing us, and that just made it so real for me to realize that, you know, there's so many people who are interested and involved in telling the stories of history. So that would be really helpful as well, Richard. But as you say, we're going to carry on with this, and David is in the process now of having finished his book, getting it published and out there. So that's going to be fascinating as well. And I know there's work going on in North Wales about the story of the Pennants family. So can I share my bit of information now that I've discovered from some research, very informal community research about the plantations that were owned by the Pennant family who went back to Wales. And Caroline, are you listening at the moment? No, she's obviously distracted. Yes, here she is. Caroline,
Yes.
when was it that Richard Pennant came back to Wales from Jamaica? 1781?
1780s, yeah, early 1780s,
Yeah,
I
because
think.
he died just after the abolition of the Slave Trade Act.
Yeah.
Okay, so the family is called Pennants with a P, okay, and they got a lot of money in the reparation, and they were able to enhance the property of the family in North Wales, which is now a National Trust property called Penrhyn Castle. So I'm particularly interested in finding out about where the plantations were in Jamaica. And one of our colleagues, Dr. Marion Gwynn, when she was doing her research for a PhD, came to Jamaica. I was there at the time, and we went round and found places, and we found the village of Pennants. And I've stayed in touch with people there ever since, and we now have what we call the Pennants Project, because we're looking at it from the Jamaican point of view, what life was like in Pennants, and we're also practically looking at ways that we can help. And David, I must give you a chance to say what's been happening with the practical help that people are giving in Scotland, you were telling me about, but I'll just do my bit first and then it's your turn. Anyway, so with the Pennants Project, I was there 1 year in Pennants. I've visited Jamaica on and off for the last 25 years, doing various education projects and initiatives. And a delightful lady called Miss Robb gave me a document about the history of the area because I was taking an interest. And I had this document quite safe. So safe that I brought it to Jamaica to Australia with me, but I'd actually forgotten that I'd got it. It's one of my things that I brought. Anyway, this document was came to light again thanks to the work of a community volunteer we've got in Pennants called Rashida. And Rashida interviewed Miss Robb and asked her about the history. And Miss Robb said, well, I gave the document to Liz years ago. She must have it somewhere. So I was then faced with trying to find this precious cyclostyle document from 1974 that talks about the tenants with a T, tenant strike in the Pennants community, and gives quite a lot of detail about it. Now, I've managed to follow up some of the detail because it was in 1938 and the tenants in Pennants went on strike and they formed a proper committee and they challenged the Lord Penrhyn and the Pennant family because of the awful treatment that the tenants were having. So they then had help from something called the Henry George Foundation in London and challenged the British government and won. But I don't know how to find out. I've spoken to the Henry George Foundation. I've spoken to the president there, who's very helpful, gave me all the links. And apparently in 1938, there was a lot of unrest in the Caribbean against the colonial owners. And that period after emancipation to the present day is really an interesting period in history because there were so many difficulties for the communities. So I don't know how to go about following this up. I don't know if anybody wants to offer to help. No, it's gone very quiet. All right, well, I'll tell you more about it as we go along, and maybe one of the weeks I'll actually identify it. I might send you the document, Richard, because we now got it typed up. That's a great help.
No, absolutely, yeah.
But it's knowing an academic who knows how to do the research to check with the check through the how it would have been challenged.
Yeah, to find that mechanism. I generally say that anything after 1900, I'm quite useless, but it does have the benefit that it might be much more legible than something before. So if we could see perhaps the particular office where that claim might have gone through, that would be the first step. So please do send.
But what the wonderful thing is that they won.
Yeah.
So the Pennant family, who are now beginning to be helpful with some reparation and improvements to the school and for the community, you know, it's good to know that we're doing that. So over to you, David. Can I ask you what's happening then with the help that or the challenge that you're making about this trust that you were telling me about?
Oh, right. Yes, that was the trust that Richard mentioned, the Dick bequest. Right. And I think this is a really, I wasn't aware of the Dick request until just before I contacted Richard. And this is somebody in Aberdeenshire, a retired teacher who's been doing research, and he drew my attention to it. And this is a trust. Their current capital is about £1.75 million. And the benefit of that is still going to schools in largely the northeast of Scotland. It does extend slightly into to my region as well. And it seems to me a very clear example of where the benefit from that trust should be going to Jamaica, where the money came from. And so it's something I'll be picking up in the new year. With Jeff and with Richard, and in a sense, it doesn't seem too big a step for the trust to say, well, up till now, the area of benefit, which I think is the legal term, has been the northeast of Scotland. From now on, the area of benefit will be Jamaica. But most of the governors are lawyers, so I'm sure there will be reasons not to do that. So yeah, that's one. Can I just say something about the little our more local project?
Yes.
I was very fortunate in February of last year to be able to go to Guyana for the first time. And with my colleague Michael Hopcroft, one of the ththings that we did was to visit the Scots Presbyterian Church in Berbice, in New Amsterdam, in part of Guyana, which last year was celebrating its 200th anniversary. That's both the 200th anniversary of their building and of the congregation. It's a congregation created by white, largely Scottish, because it's a Presbyterian church, Scottish planters in Guyana. It's now an Afro-Guyanese congregation. One of the things that took us aback was that in that 200th anniversary year, Michael and myself were their only contact with Scotland. And when I've come back and said that to people, I mean, people have both been struck by the strength of the Scottish historical connection with Guyana, but also this complete lack of connection now. I'm really pleased. I live in a small place called Cromarty. The population of Cromarty is about 800 people. There's a Cromarty in Guyana, which is much bigger, actually, I think. And on the back of that, a group in Cromarty decided that they wanted to do something practical. So in September, October, November, a local group has launched an online appeal. We've raised £4,000. We've now got that to the church in Guyana, and they're going to use that to refurbish the kitchen in one of their buildings, which they will then use to enable them to take part in a program which will provide free school meals for some of the poorest children in the local primary school. So it's been, it's small scale, but I think it's an important kind of reaction here that people really wanted to do something, and so we managed to transfer that money just before Christmas. So it's been an interesting little example, but I hope we can build that into some kind of longer term relationship, because I think that would be the really valuable thing. The local secondary school here will be doing something, I think, with current lockdown. I'm not sure exactly what that's going to be, but they're going to become involved as well. So it's been a good experience.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And I think it's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. And if you get to speak to anybody, say, that you were talking about it and we all thought it was a really brilliant. The reparation unit, Professor Vereen Shepherd, she was fascinated by what we're trying to do, because she said it was the first example she'd heard of community reparation. And I think that's quite interesting. So yours is an example as well. And so the reparation unit, apart from campaigning for reparation, is also looking at how reparation is happening and how things are going on. So I think that's really, really very positive. And I'm in awe. We're still trying to sort our bank account out to do our appeal. So Caroline, we're meeting tomorrow and we're going to sort the bank account out.
Well,
That'll be the North Wales Jamaica Society.
We decided that the problems of trying to sort out bank accounts were just beyond us. So we just collected money and somebody took responsibility for transferring it. And
oh, very good. Very good.
So
well, maybe we're making it more complicated for ourselves. I'm not sure. Okay, well, I really appreciate the fact that we've had a really good session today and a very focused session. So that's been good. So I'm just going to tell you now about what's going to be happening next week. I've invited a colleague from way back when, a gentleman called Dr. Tony Talbot, and he's going to be talking about a children's book that he wrote some years ago called The History on the Page, Adventures in Black British History. Now I'll put this information on the website so that if you want to look on Amazon, you can check it out there. And I've also started doing, whether I keep this going every week, I don't know, but this is like an update newsletter, all right, evidence, because I haven't sent it out yet. So that each week we'll say about what we're going to do, and also what we're going to do the next week, but also things like the website that you're talking about. Sorry, the PowerPoint presentation, Richard, is how we make that accessible through the website, because it all got a bit complicated after 12 sessions. There was that much, so I've tried to rationalize it a bit. Anyway, so that'll be Dr. Tony Talbot, and also someone I met here in Australia, a gentleman called Levi Lawrence, whose father was actually one of the people who travelled on the Empire Windrush. Now, the Windrush story is another story of ours. So he says that he couldn't make it tonight, but he said, it's night time here. He said he'd try next week, and his father was interviewed by the BBC, and it might have been broadcast at the time in probably the 70s or 80s, but it's very interesting. It's a very different take that his father has on anything that I've heard in interviews of others of the Windrush generation. So those two things we're looking forward to next week. We're also looking forward to, at some stage, being involved with Professor Fred Hickling's wife, Hilary Hickling. Do you remember before Christmas she came and we talked about his book, and he talks about owning our madness, and she's promised that she'll send us some information and she'll do one of the sessions for us. But excitingly, and this is again about books, this Caroline sent me in the post. I was so delighted to get it. It's David Olasuga's children's version, A Short Essential History of Black and British. And it's brilliant. And for the likes of me who finds it a bit difficult to get through huge academic tomes, something like this can give a really good overview. So I think it's interesting to kind of compare this and also the historical fiction we're going to hear about next week, and we'll ask Tony if if he's had a chance to see this and to recognise that. And as I was saying earlier, but I can't remember whether we were recording or not, but yes, brilliant. I'm really going to enjoy reading this, Helen, The Butterfly and the Bee, to learn more about the story of Henry Morton, Stanley and Dorothy Tennant. And Gwyneth sent her apologies to the session today as well. So we've covered all sorts of things just in a very few minutes there, but with the theme of books. And what we were trying to do last term, that's Learning Links International, we were trying to set up a Black History Book Club once a month. But once a month was ending up as not very often compared with these sessions, which was easier to keep the momentum. So we're now thinking that we'd like to offer the opportunity for people to develop Black History book clubs in their area. And so the North Wales Jamaica Society are going to have a group of people just in North Wales looking at Black History books. But we thought we'd have a website which would have different recommended books. And Professor Satie, I'm also remembering that we've got a promise to try and help you with some books for your library. And I've got a couple of people looking at it, and different people have made offers. I know Jim Thakordin is keen to help you, but we just need to coordinate it and work out how to get it to you. But we might be able to do that through the North Wales Africa Society with Salamatu Fada. So I think that might work as well. So we're going to keep this keep that on the agenda. Don't think we've forgotten about it, please. Just haven't It is
Thank
very
you.
difficult for everyone at the moment,
Yeah,
wherever we
sure,
are in the
sure.
world. It is just so difficult.
I was asking if 2020 can be abolished from the calendar of events of the whole, the world.
Sorry, say that
That was
again.
just I said 2020 was so difficult that I was asking if it could be abolished.
Yes. well,
some people are already asking for their money back for 2021.
Yes. Okay then, so let's stop the recording now. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, but don't go away.